Thanks so much, JP. JP's been a wonderful member of the Tom Lee Institute board and will be speaking next week, in fact, on architecture. He redid the Gage Hotel and Marathon and came here to El Paso to do his research. And so at the History Museum next Saturday, he'll be speaking at 2 o'clock, and then at the Historical Society again on El Paso's constellation of artists. So we really appreciate JP. But it was in the spring of 1995 when I first met Laura Bush. It was in the backyard of Alumni Lodge on the UTEP campus where luncheon was being held. I just completed recording Tom Lee's oral history, which was published by Texas Western Press, and she'd come out with Isabella Cunningham, the UT president's chancellor's wife, to look at it. It was a UT Christmas gift. But I'll never forget seeing her for the first time in that backyard and how understated she was, and how she was so interested in other people and asking them questions about themselves. In fact, on that first visit, she asked if she could come visit my gallery, and she did. And after that, I invited her back to El Paso for the dedication of Plaza de los Largatos in San Jacinto Plaza, and she came. In fact, if my memory serves me right, her husband's first term as governor, Laura Bush returned to El Paso 16 times. And every time that she did come, she had ideas of what she'd like to do, like climb Mount Cristo Rey, visit the zoo and the museum, attend the YWCA luncheon, visit the Chamizal, walk Rim Road, and visit the Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe Mission and FAMAP's Hospital de la Familia in Ciudad Juárez. And every visit seemed like a homecoming. Later, when I was appointed chairman of the President's Committee on the Arts and the Humanities, I used to invite people from Washington to visit El Paso. And then I'd go back to Washington and say, Laura, James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, just loved El Paso. He couldn't believe the Bhutanese architecture at UTEP or the view from RIM. And Bruce Cole, why, he couldn't believe that we had Spanish heritage here. He'd never heard of that. He loved El Paso. And Dana Gioia, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, he couldn't believe that we could go over to Juárez and enjoy dinner. He loved El Paso too, and I'll never forget her words to me, and they were these. She said, Adair, I have no doubt they loved El Paso. El Paso is a place I long for. And it's my great pleasure right now to introduce to you my good friend, Laura Bush.
Thank you so much, Adair. That was very sweet. Thank you all. Thank you so much, and thank you, Adair. I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I'm very happy to have this chance to tell you a little bit about my El Paso before we watch Tom Lee and hear him talk about his El Paso. Adair is a wonderful ambassador for your city, and I know you know that. So thank you, Adair, for introducing so many people to El Paso and to Tom Lee. And I think the commanding general of Fort Bliss, who's a native El Paso and is here, General Petard, are you here, and Lucille? I also want to recognize all the members of the U.S. military who are here with us tonight. Your former commander-in-chief sends his very best to all of you. I want to recognize the board members of the Tom Lee Institute and thank J.P. Bryant, the Master of Ceremonies and the Chairman-elect of the Institute. J.P. is a terrific talker, speech maker himself, as you could tell. I'm happy that some members of Tom Lee's family are here tonight. Tom Lee's granddaughter, Catherine Lee Weeks, and her husband, Chris, from Houston have joined us, and thank you, Catherine and Chris. And I especially want to recognize Monica Wong, the librarian director from the Jenna Welch Laura Bush Library, located on the northwest campus of the El Paso Community College. The Jenna Welch Laura Bush Library is an academic public partnership between the El Paso Community College and El Paso Public Library. And the Jenna Welch Laura Bush Library will benefit from the sale of my book this evening. My publisher, Scribner, donated these books so that 100% of the proceeds will go to the library, so be sure and pick up a book on your way out. I also want to thank especially all of our sponsors: Wells Fargo Private Bank, El Paso Electric Company, Federico and Guadalupe de la Vega, the Hunt Family Foundation, Humanities Texas, the City of El Paso Museums and Cultura Affairs Department, with support from the Texas Commission on the Arts, Betty Ruth Wakefield Haley, Francis Roderick Ackelson, Western Refinery, and Lisa Taylor, who's a sponsor in honor of her parents, Henry and Pat Taylor. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I've looked forward to this for months. I love to come to El Paso. I'm thrilled to be here to celebrate the life of the renowned artist and author and my friend, Tom Lee. One of the very best things about being back home in our state now is that El Paso is so much closer, and I can get here a lot more often. George and I are happy that we're back home in Texas, living what I call the afterlife in a state George calls the Promised Land. We've been busy planning the Bush Presidential Center at SMU and promoting our memoirs. My book, Spoken from the Heart, came out a year ago, May, and George's book, Decision Points, hit the shelves last November. Nothing quite prepares you for the whirlwind of a book tour, although I guess an election campaign comes pretty close. After launching the book tour in Washington, D.C., I spent the next 27 days crisscrossing the United States, talking to people in 24 different cities. Despite a few train delays, missing pilots, and even one or two plane breakdowns, it was a great month getting to share the stories of my book with Americans from all walks of life. We even had a security breach, if you count the suburban women in one southern city who had forgotten to take their mace and stun guns out of their purses. The Secret Service was disturbed. And along the way, I got to see many friends and work with a lot of great booksellers. I've spent much of my life surrounded by books. I was an avid reader as a child. My mother and I were regular fixtures at the Midland County Public Library, which is why we're so thrilled to have a library named for us, especially a library in my mother's childhood home of the Upper Valley. I continued my love for books through college, through elementary school teaching in Dallas and Houston, through graduate school in library science, and then as a librarian in Austin. I made a career out of my love for books. And to spread that love, I helped found the Texas Book Festival and the National Book Festival. But while I love reading books, I never thought I would write one, and certainly not one about myself. But as George's 8 years in office drew to a close, publishers began calling, asking me when I was going to write a book. And I realized then that there was, in fact, a lot I wanted to say. Our years in Washington, the first decade of the new century, were as consequential as almost any other time in our history. We lived through the most vicious attack on our homeland in the history of our nation. I was on Capitol Hill on the morning of September 11th, sitting in the office of the late Senator Ted Kennedy, preparing to give a presentation to his Education Committee, when the World Trade Center was engulfed in flames. The Pentagon was struck, and a few dozen brave men and women defeated their hijackers above a grassy Pennsylvania field. George and I cried with the grieving families, and we prayed with the nation. And we never forgot that day for the rest of his time in office, and we'll never forget it for the rest of our lives. I met so many of the brave men and women who volunteered to defend our country, who risk and give their lives so that we might never know terror again. And I've met the voices for freedom, like the former Czech president, Václav Havel, the great intellectual and playwright who for years was imprisoned by the communists, but who never gave up his hopes for freedom. When the Iron Curtain fell, he stepped up to lead his country, and he's still speaking out on behalf of the oppressed. I met the Dalai Lama from Tibet and female candidates for parliament in Kuwait who ran for office in 2006, the first year that women there were granted the right to vote. And I met women in Afghanistan who under the Taliban could not leave their houses alone, couldn't be educated, who would be beaten for wearing shoes that made too much noise when they walked. Now their lives are changing. In my book, I wanted to give voice to all of these remarkable people and to share these experiences with others. And I wanted to remember the many wonderful people I met here at home, the volunteers from the Red Cross and the Baptist men who drove all night to the storm-ravaged Gulf Coast after Katrina to cook meals for those in need, and who stayed for months helping people there rebuild. Or the brave Coast Guard volunteers who rescued some 30,000 stranded people after the hurricane struck. I wanted to tell of the days I spent with young men in our cities and towns, many of whom were ex-gang members and who were trying to turn their lives around. I was never prouder than when, as part of my own Helping America's Youth initiative, I was able to welcome a group of ex-gang members from Los Angeles to the White House, the same house where we hosted the Queen of England and the Pope on his birthday. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had some great stories to tell. I had so many wonderful memories to share. Memories about the White House, stories about our life there and our family. And I thought, yes, I'll happily write a book. The publishers were excited and they said, great, let's make the book almost all about the White House. January 20th, 2009 came and went, and we came home to Texas. And I realized that I couldn't write a book just about the White House. I had to write about my home and George's home as well. We're Texans. Who we are, what we value, how we live our lives was shaped by the dusty red soil of Midland in the heart of West Texas and the Permian Basin. Who we are as adults was cemented in our Midland ranch house, and then our Dallas house, and then the historic governor's house in Austin. We were formed by Texas, shaped by our friends here, our family here, and our life here. When I began the book, one of the first things I did was go home to Midland and drive past those little one-story post-war houses that my father built after he came home from fighting in Europe during World War II. I drove by the houses that George and I lived in when we had Barbara and Jenna. I went to the First Methodist Church where I'd gone as a child, the church where George and I were married and where Jenna and Barbara were baptized. And as I traveled around Midland, I knew that my story begins and ends in Texas. In fact, if it weren't for a love story that began right here in El Paso, my own story might never have come to be. Even before my story begins, there were stories from here, from El Paso, that I heard from my grandparents and my parents. So here's a little bit from my book about my El Paso. My mother's parents, Jesse and Hal Hawkins, Grammy and Papaw, moved to El Paso in 1927. Like my daddy's parents, the Welches, both had been born in Arkansas. Papaw's health was what drove the Hawkinses to move west. He had asthma, and everyone believed that the dry desert air of the Southwest contained some kind of magical cure. Thousands of World War I veterans who had been gassed in the trenches across France had moved to New Mexico, Arizona, and the far reaches of West Texas, seeking a balm for their ravaged lungs. My grandparents settled in the Upper Valley, 1 block from the Rio Grande, which rolled and lapped in its riverbed before it turned narrow and sluggish alongside the city of El Paso itself. They chose a place right off Old Highway 80, now Donovan Road. Highway 80 was the main road to California before the government put through the interstate. As late as the 1950s, it hummed with cars making their way west. Jesse and Hal built a small tourist court, a cluster of tiny one-room cottages with a single communal bathroom in the middle. During the Depression, carloads of people fleeing the devastation of the Dust Bowl and the complete collapse of life back east would stop at a tourist court and shower and sleep in the primitive cottages or doze in their cars or outside on the warm ground before moving on to California. To supplement what little they made from the tourist court, my grandparents opened a grocery where they sold bologna and pickles and loaves of bread and a few other staples that people might buy before they crossed the New Mexico line to travel on beyond. They ran a lumber yard, and at one point, Hal Hawkins had enough money to buy a small block off Highway 80 and put up just a few houses. Grammy and Papaw built their own house on that street. It was an orange house covered in smooth, orange-glazed brick, surplus from the Army's rush to slap up vast new kitchens and dining halls for the freshly minted troops converging on Fort Bliss. My grandfather may have gotten it for free or talked his way into buying it at a cut rate. However he got it, every brick was bright, shocking orange. One day in 1943, when Mother brought my daddy home to meet her parents, the first thing he saw was my beautiful petite grandmother, Jessie Hawkins, down on her knees with a bucket of mortar that she had mixed herself and a trowel in her hand, laying brick. That was how Harold Welch met his future mother-in-law. My father always enjoyed telling that story, invariably adding his own punchline, that when he first saw Jessie Hawkins laying brick, he thought, "Great, I'm marrying into a family whose women can do anything." It was Mother who first saw Daddy. She spotted him on the street in El Paso when she was looking out of a second-floor window of the Popular Dry Goods Company, where she worked in the advertising department. Of course, it helped that one of her friends in the department was married to a man who knew Harold Welch. She remembers her friend saying, "Look, there's Hal," which is what they called him then. But the fact is that my mother went over and looked out of the window at that exact moment, and there he was. Their first date was at the Tivoli nightclub in Ciudad Juarez. Mother remembers how everyone parked in El Paso and then all dressed up, paid 6 cents to walk across the footbridge into Mexico. Juarez was a glamorous place. Later, when I was little, I remember Mother and Daddy getting ready to go over to Juarez for the evening. Mother in a big circle dress. Daddy fussing with the knot on his tie to get it just so. I begged to go with them. The first club at the base of the bridge was the Tivoli, and then a little farther down was another place called Lobby Number 2, and other clubs fanned out from that. The braver people ventured farther out into the city, where one time there was a jockey club and bullfights staged for the Americans. But Mother said that she and Harold never did any of that. The clubs had exotic at least for West Texas, floor shows and orchestras for dancing. That first night in Juarez, my mother and father ordered boquilla black bass for dinner. The next morning, a little item ran in the gossip column of the El Paso paper, noting that Jenna Hawkins had been seen dancing with a handsome stranger at the Tivoli. Mother and Daddy began dating, and they were smitten fast. It was wartime. The Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States was at war with the Germans. Daddy was nearly 30 years old, but he enlisted right here at Fort Bliss. His assignment was an anti-aircraft brigade attached to the 104th Infantry Division, known as the Timberwolves. His unit trained in Florida, Louisiana, and at Fort Bliss. When he was on leave, he courted my mother. Once she invited him on a picnic up in the El Paso foothills. She carefully packed a basket and a blanket. But Daddy, who was spending his time mired in the dirt of basic training, declined to eat on the ground. They balanced their plates on their laps and ate sitting inside the car with the window rolled down. In January of 1944, they were married in the chapel of Fort Bliss, right before Daddy was to be shipped off to Europe. He wore his Army dress uniform. Mother followed him briefly to his next base in Alexandria, Louisiana. But within weeks, my father was sent east, and Mother came back to El Paso. She returned to her job at the Popular Dry Goods advertising department, got a roommate, and hung on every letter. The memory of dancing at the Tivoli was one of the many memories that Mother and Daddy relived during their separation. In one letter Daddy sent, after Germany surrendered and he was waiting for passage home, he told Mother he didn't like to go to a club and have too many beers with his friends, because then I get to missing you so much I can't stand it. After the war, Daddy came home to El Paso, but before too long, Daddy accepted a post as district manager for the Universal CIT Credit Corporation in Midland, which is where my story began. By the time I was 6, my parents decided that I was ready to travel on my own and sent me on the train to El Paso to visit my grandparents. They handed my ticket to the porter at the Midland station and waved me off. Mother had packed a lunch for me because she knew I wasn't old enough to go to the dining car and write down what I wanted on the little pad of paper. It was a nearly 6-hour train ride through Pecos, Van Horn, Sierra Blanca, across sparse open land and long-vanished buffalo trails. Grammy and Papa would meet me at the station in their pickup truck and drive me out to Cañatía, where they had their home. I loved my Grammy with a particular devotion. Jessie Laura Hawkins, my mother's mother, had been only 21 when Mother was born. She was nearly 3 decades younger than my grandmother Welch, and still quite young. And she loved to play. Not only did she make my clothes and doll clothes, but she also built my doll furniture by hand, little couches covered in lush brown velvet with tiny navy velvet pillows edged in rich gold braid. I thought they were the most elegant doll furniture ever. I loved going to visit Grammy and Papa for those 2 or 3 weeks in the summer, to be enveloped by the desert heat and lulled by the simple repetition of Grammy's daily life. It was, I suppose, not so far removed from daily chores in Midland, cooking, watering the yard, doing the wash and cleaning, and endless sweeping out of the house. But the location was infinitely more interesting, with the Rio Grande on one side and the Franklin Mountains bumping up against us on the other. As Grammy was fascinating. Unlike most mothers I knew who wore dresses and aprons, she wore pants, hats, gloves, and big long-sleeve shirts to cover her skin, because out in the valley the sun was especially bright and searing. The Texas poet Marian Haddad wrote once about El Paso, "The sun is different here, drastic and dense," she called it, and it truly is. There's something thick and liquid about the light, more than can be accounted for by the fact that El Paso sits up closer to the sun than Midland. Grammy was a collector, too. Her house and garden, an artful arrangement of what man and nature had left behind. She saved old Mexican coins, many of them gold, and smooth Indian grindstones that wandering or fleeing tribes had abandoned along the rough paths in the Franklin Mountain foothills. Tucked away in a wooden drawer was a little box of shells and the tiny, perfect skeleton of a seahorse, what remained of an all but forgotten long ago visit to the sea. She collected rocks, each with its own lengthy geological tale, and empty bottles that others casually tossed aside. Her bottles grew so numerous that she built a ring of shelves for them above the windows in her modest window-covered porch. The less interesting and more ubiquitous beer bottles she dispatched to her garden, where she marked off her lower beds by planting their stubby necks deep into the ground until only the glinting round bottoms peeked up from the earth. Most of Grammy's garden, aside from where she grew a patch of asparagus that reliably sprouted year after year, was a wonderful, vast rock garden. There was no trash collection out where she and Papa lived, hence the bottles. So whatever they could reuse was recycled into that garden. She planted flowers inside the well of an enormous rubber tire that must have rolled off a truck plodding along the highway. In another corner, a faded wagon wheel stuck up from the sand. She took shards of pottery and cemented them onto urns that she placed along a wall, constructed of her own homemade cinder block, which she made from a rectangular mold that she filled with concrete mix. She grew yuccas, ocotillas, maguey, and pomegranate trees, and a big, bright swath of daffodils. The bulbs had come from her mother's house in Arkansas. When my mother moved to Midland, Grammy divided up the bulbs and gave some to Mother, who planted them in her yard and lovingly dug them up and replanted them each time she moved to another house. When George and I married and came back to Midland, Mother did the same for me, appearing at my doorstep with 100 bulbs, the offspring of that long, fallow Arkansas yard 4 generations removed. Sometimes I would follow Grammy around, but mostly I played, staking out a corner of the garden. I built sprawling sand ranches that stretched across the ground and arranged the plump mesquite beans that I'd chosen to be my cattle. But I was rarely alone. New Way Drive, Grammy and Papa's block, was teeming with other children, and they became my friends all those summers. Mornings were spent outside in the baking heat. Then once the blazing sun settled atop the sky, we retreated inside to eat our main meal and lie down for a siesta. Only in the late afternoon did we get up and bathe. My grandmother would put on a dress, and my grandfather would change his shirts and pants, and we'd all go for a ride in his pickup truck. If it was just the 3 of us, I sat wedged between them in the cab. But most of the time, I piled into the flatbed with an assortment of neighborhood kids and Bully, our old Midland dog. Then we'd be off, bumping along the levee road that edged right up against the Rio Grande. Papa would stop, lift Bully out of the truck, and send him running toward the river. Bully would plunge in and paddle about the placid Rio Grande. Then he'd get out, shake, and run after the truck until he had dried off, and then Papa would hoist Bully back in. To a 6 or 7-year-old, those late afternoon rides seemed like the greatest adventures in the world. There was a wildness, too, in the upper valley that did not exist among the imported trees and rectangular subdivisions of Midland. Once, behind the orange house, I came upon Bully shaking a rattlesnake to death in his terrier teeth. I watched as the rattler's body broke into pieces, one portion of his scales flying through the open window of the truck cab. It was terrible and mesmerizing at the same time. In the evenings, we'd sit in our clean, dressed-up clothes in Grammy and Papa's living room and talk. Then Grammy would fix supper, usually just a bowl of cereal or a dish of ice cream, which we ate at the kitchen table. The kitchen of my childhood memory is a large, spacious room. Only much later did I step inside and discover that it was quite small. The whole house was small. It was a four-square house, only 4 rooms, 2 bedrooms, the living room and the kitchen, with a little center hall. At night, because of the desert, the house was cool. We slept with the windows open. I spent the night on a double bed in the little guest room, but I was not alone. When the lights went out, Grammy would slip in wearing her plain cotton nightie to sleep with me. I can still remember how great it felt to lie there in the quiet dark with only a sheet resting on top as the cool desert breeze wafted in. And I remember, too, the unspoken comfort of those nights as we drifted off and Grammy held my hand, not letting go until long after we were both asleep. Grammy and Papa had a pattern to their life that I liked, and I could imagine living like that, in the quiet of the valley with the sand and the river and the sun. Sometimes, particularly when Mother and Daddy came, we went for longer drives, following the valley out into the neighboring New Mexico, heading past the acres of pecan trees at Stallman Farms, and past San Miguel with its tiny church built entirely of black volcanic rock, all the way up past the rich farmland of Las Cruces. I would sit in the back of the car, the bright light radiating through the window, and daydream about living on a ranch in the upper valley, raising hot green chilies, onions, and pecans. For years, every visit to El Paso included a trip to Juarez. When they visited, Mother and Daddy would go over at night for dinner or to sit in a club with their El Paso friends. But in the daylight, it was my turn to cross into Mexico with Grammy and Papa, and sometimes with Mother and Daddy as well. We'd drive into town, park the car, and walk across the barbed wire lace bridge with the river draining below. On the other side, Grammy and Papa would stop for a Mexican beer. Then we headed to the open-air market, which beckoned with baskets, embroidered cotton tops, hand-hewn guitars, and wooden puppets. The pottery was my favorite. I ambled from stall to stall, comparing brightly painted birds and red and green leaves on a miniature tea sets, carefully selecting my purchase. Today, at home in Crawford and in Dallas, I have cabinets and shelves lined with vibrant Mexican jugs and bowls. El Paso continued to call me long after I grew up. I came here for a summer in college, taking classes at Mother's old Texas College of Mines and Metallurgy, which by then was Texas Western and has since been renamed a third time as University of Texas at El Paso. I came again as a woman in my 40s and 50s to talk to writers, stroll through art galleries, take in the city and the land. There remains something mystical about El Paso, built into the mountain pass that divides Mexico and Texas, sliced by the Rio Grande in its winding journey to the Gulf of Mexico. But perhaps other factors account for the city's magnetic pull. In 1971, a Texas biochemist declared that the city's groundwater was heavily fortified with lithium in its natural state. Some of my longtime El Paso friends said that people who move away invariably find themselves moving back because they're not happy anywhere but El Paso. During my first visit to El Paso after George was elected governor, I met Tom Lee. My mother had always admired Tom Lee. She was younger than Tom, but growing up in El Paso at the same time, she knew of him. She came to love his work, both his paintings and his books. So we had his books, The King Ranch and The Wonderful Country, and others on our bookshelves at home when I was growing up. And we had many of J. Frank Dobie's books that Tom had illustrated. Tom Lee was an author and artist who I respected and admired because of my mother and because of the books I had grown up with. So it was a thrill to meet him. And on every trip to El Paso after that, I would get to see Tom and his wife, Sarah. I visited their home, where I saw Tom's magnificent portrait of Sarah. Once, a group of us caravanned into Chihuahua to Pacame to visit the pottery makers at Casas Grandes. It was Adair and me, Tom and Sarah, James Drake and his wife Colleen, and Tony Garza, who was then Texas Secretary of State. It was a wonderful visit to see the history that Juan Casado revived from the shards of pottery left by ancient people, to see the pottery makers, and to see it all through Tom's eyes. Tom was almost blind by then, but he did his last painting from that trip, a pastel of adobe walls in Mexico. Even with his failing sight, he captured the scene brilliantly. That's what made Tom great. His work expressed the history and character of the Southwest and brought it to life for millions of people who may never have been here. But for those of us familiar with this terrain, we're reminded how talented Tom was when life reminds us of his art. Just a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Big Bend area with my hiking friends. We stayed at the astronomer's house at McDonald's Observatory, and we hiked in Big Bend National Park. While we were there, we talked about how the big sky in the desert mountain landscape reminded us of Tom and his paintings. Tom's landscapes bring the Southwest to life on canvas. The parched desert, the color of the sunset, and the huge open sky on a sunny day. And his work reflects his optimism and his passion for life. He once wrote, "Sarah and I live on the east side of our mountain. It's the sunrise side, not the sunset side. It's the side to see the day that's coming, not the side to see the day that's gone. The best day is the day coming, with the work to do, with the eyes wide open, with the heart grateful." In his 2000 convention speech, George quoted Tom's words and ended by saying, "Americans live on the sunrise side of the mountain." When George was elected president, we chose to hang Tom's beautiful painting, The Rio Grande, in the Oval Office to remind us of home. You can see that painting now at the El Paso Museum of Art. Tom died shortly after George became president, and I traveled home to attend his funeral. Today, Tom's inspiration lives on in his work, challenging all of us to embrace life as he did, with eyes wide open, with a grateful heart, ready to face the day that's coming. Thank you all very much, and now we'll see Tom Lee's El Paso.